So I just wanted to spend the rest of this the recording talking about the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regs 1999. So this is the main piece of legislation which requires risk assessments for any premises, and it requires them to be written down if you've got 5 or more employees. It requires you to adopt the principles of prevention, which we'll talk about more in the next session, and part B, and you should consider health surveillance. Then put in place procedures for serious or imminent danger. So it says in Regulation 3.1 that every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of his employees and non-employees. So you need to consider members of the public that are likely to gain access to the workplace or be affected by hazards arising from that workplace. So this may be if you've got something that can cause releases of chemical spills, it could be people downstream, or if you on a local water course, or it could be for gas releases, people that are in the local neighbourhood, or indeed if you are open to the members of the public, it could be people that walk into your workshop. You also want to consider the non-typical, so you're thinking about maintenance crews that are going to be coming in there, people are fitting new systems, so only the foreseeable non-typical events, rather than just trying to spend an infinite time coming up with anything that might happen. So it doesn't tell you what suitable and sufficient is, and we'll again come on to that in the next part of this session. So a risk assessment should ensure all significant risks to the hazards are addressed. It should ensure, so in your assignment you'll only be looking at 5, so don't worry too much about that. But significant is anything which has a higher level of risk than you would experience in daily life. So if you are ensuring all aspects of work activity are reviewed, including routine and the non-routine, so the foreseeable non-routine. Consider procedures to mitigate the effects of an accident. It should be systematic. It should take account of how work is organised, and it should take account of risks to the public. So findings and stuff that you write down if you've got 5 or more employees should include a record of preventative and protective measures. As you refer back when you reviewed that risk assessment to see what the preventative and protective measures were. You then make an assessment of whether that was adequate, and then you might change them if you determine that further action was required to reduce the risk. So you can give proof then that an adequate risk assessment has been done by having this all written down. And if you are reviewing or revising it, you need to review it on adequate intervals. Typically annually is enough for this, or with any significant change to the workplace. Let's say taking on an employee which might present so it might have a different level of risk from the hazards that you got in your workplace. Again, we refer to your enormous male versus your very small female manual handling. If you took on a new member of staff that had to do that manual handling, you may want to review the risk assessments you have in place to see if they are adequate for that new employee. If you had a change to the process, you brought in a new machine or technology, or you started doing things with different procedures, then again you would revise the risk assessment in the view of those changes. So the principles of prevention under the management regs is this approach where you avoid risk altogether if at all possible. If you can't avoid it, then evaluate it and try and combat it at source where possible. So your first response should not always be how do you deal with the risks from this hazard. You use personal protective equipment because that is trying to protect the worker from the danger by putting something around the worker. Whereas if you can stop that, so if you can do something to screen off the worker at the source of the hazard, then that is what you would do. So a good example of that would be guarding on machinery. You could put a guard on your circular saw, and that would be a much better approach than giving the worker a pair of thick gloves in the hope that the gloves would prevent them from being cut to pieces when they catch their fingers in the blade. So adapt the work to the individual, which we've already talked about. Train workers in order to try to reduce the level of risk so that they carry out work in a safe way. You can see this is a few steps down this hierarchy because people are people and will always have a habit to do what they want rather than necessarily what you want them to do. Encourage a positive health and safety culture. Avoid and reduce the levels of hazards. The levels of risk from hazards. There I go, misusing the terminology. And decrease risk by design where possible. And so you can design out problems wherever you can. Risk assessment should give a program with deadlines for reducing risk. So you don't end up with this, well, we'll do it at some point in the future, but we might not get round to it. You might get round to it. You want to have a thorough and systematic approach to things. It may need to include health surveillance, where health surveillance will improve protection. So levels of noise exposure. You might use personal dose meters. You might want to use atmospheric monitoring for levels of dust in the atmosphere. Health surveillance. So this is environment. So that's more environmental surveillance. Health surveillance could include regular appointments with an occupational health nurse or doctor who would then be able to spot hearing problems from high levels of noise or respiratory problems from high levels of dust, and they would be able to bring into play measures to mitigate further advancements of those conditions, and basically you could take action to where the level of health is still the level of illness is still temporary, or you be able to put in place measures to prevent it from getting any worse. Appoint competent people to help with risk assessment. So where you don't have the expertise within your workplace, then it says that you should go outside in order to bring those expertise in. If you have the expertise within your workplace to do the risk assessment itself, but you need experts in order to provide you with advice whilst doing the risk assessment for one particular area or hazard, then you need. It says here that you should get that expert and use them. It tells you to give information on the risks to their health and safety found to employees for the risks found in the assessment. So you need to communicate the findings of the risk assessment to the employees in a way which they can understand. So if you have people who do not speak English as their first language, then you've got to find some other way of getting that information across to them that they will understand. And that duty is on the employer. Separate consideration of young. So you need special risk assessments for young people, given their naivety and the fact that they are still developing, both in their physical constitution and in their mental patterns. They may be more vulnerable to certain hazards than others. You need to consider temporary staff and their consideration for them. And there's particular risk assessments for new and expectant mothers, and also for anybody who is disabled, even though it doesn't mention that here. And employees are actually required under this legislation to cooperate